those of you who are here, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Demystifying Audience Modeling with DataViz. My name is Sammy Anderson. I am our marketing coordinator here at Softcrylic. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, kind of how we were chatting in the actual chat, feel free to throw them there or in the actual Q&A. If the question doesn't get addressed in the webinar, we'll make sure to either follow up with you post-webinar with your information, or we'll make sure to address it in a follow-up blog, which will be sent to all attendees. The recording will also be sent out after the webinar, so you can rewatch it and you'll get first access to that. There's going to be a poll launched. Make sure you answer the poll. And with that being said, if you have further questions, please email events@softcrylic.com. And I'm happy to pass it over to our two wonderful panelists, Josiah Martin from our data science and advanced analytics practice, and our DataViz practice lead, Corey Turner. Enjoy the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro there, Sammy. So just to kind of set the table here, we're going to be going through introductions today, just real quick for Corey and myself, then touching on just a pretty high level overview of what we mean when we talk about audience modeling or segmentation. Then we're going to delve a little bit deeper into a specific case study where we use this, this method and talk about some of the kind of benefits of using and leveraging DataViz within that and unpacking kind of some of the results and interpreting the results from the modeling itself. And then the last thing we're going to do is just touch on the results, right? What happens when we actually use those clusters and put those into action and test it on those. So Sammy kind of gave us a brief introduction here, but just to expand on that a little bit more, I am from the advanced analytics and data science practice. So there's a couple of very specific use cases in which we've employed and used this audience modeling to kind of help drive additional discovery with clients and help them to understand their audiences a little bit better, you know, characteristics specific to them and how they kind of create these behaving groups of customers and how we can kind of use that to then just improve targeting and really marketing efforts there. And a lot of this work then I've been able to kind of work alongside Corey and have him and use his wizardry to help visualize some of that, but I'll let him kind of introduce himself here real quick. Expand on that a little bit.
I got it and click the next slide. I'm Corey Turner. I lead the data visualization practice and I have problems with slide control. Anyway, I'm glad that Josiah went first because I was thinking that he should definitely have top billing on this panel. Even though the graphics that we grabbed from marketing had it the other way around. Anyway, yeah, so I lead the DataViz practice, and you know, this sort of case study that we're going to talk about today is really a great sort of cross-practice example of what we do here at Softcrylic. I mean, certainly there's data engineering involved, you know, in getting the data to the data science team in the first place, but then, you know, the data science team doing their, you know, sort of wizardry on the data to sort of develop these whole clusters. And then the way that we were able to come after and pick that up and really find ways to make it understandable and really sort of pop for our customers in the business. It's really sort of, this is a great highlight for how we sort of work together as a team at Softcrylic, and I'm really excited to walk through this use case for you guys today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's gonna be a lot of fun, and I think people like get a lot from it. So just to kind of start off with here, wanted to touch on exactly what we mean when we talk about audience modeling here. And in theory, it's a pretty simple scheme here. What we want to do is really look at the fact that organizations are constantly collecting data about their customers, and honestly, more than most organizations know what to do with. And that's where this kind of concept comes in, this audience modeling, and using this data and really leveraging it to expand your customer base, improve return on ad spend, and increase just brand awareness in general. And this is something, again, that I think it's becoming a little bit more of a buzzword, and just a topic that a lot of people are constantly talking about. But there's still, I think, a little bit of just a gap between what marketers want to accomplish and then having the resources and the background necessary to achieve true audience modeling and tap into that potential there. And then kind of from more of a practical perspective, it's not always quite as straightforward as just collecting the data and then performing cluster analysis, and then you've got these awesome insights and you're ready to go. You start out with, as kind of Corey was talking about here, data gathering, right? That really is, I think, probably the most vital step. Wouldn't you say, Corey?
Absolutely. I mean, without data, we've got nothing, right?
Yeah, and I think this is kind of one of the steps that's most often overlooked, or at least rushed, right? But I think this is really the grounds to any sort of successful analysis using clustering here, and just making sure that you've established a data pipeline for properly ingesting that data and storing it, and then allowing it to then be easily accessible to you when you need to pull out that data and use it for something. And then that second step is actually applying, then once you have that data aggregated and collected, applying that machine learning and statistical model. And in this case, we're talking specifically about unsupervised machine learning, or clustering, as a lot of people call it. And the beauty about this is that segmentation or clustering puts the data to work for you by identifying the patterns in your data that are oftentimes indetectable to the mere human eye, right? Something that you couldn't pick out just by looking at the data yourself. And so the beauty of this is that we're not actually doing anything in terms of telling the model what to go find. There's minimal human input, right? And we're just allowing the algorithm to go in there and discover those patterns for itself. And there are many different types of clustering algorithms that can be used. I'm not going to go into all those here today, just for the sake of brevity and getting to some of the more important things that we want to talk about today. But if you are interested in that, then we do have another webinar that we kind of delve into that a little bit more specifically. And feel free to reach out and we can connect you with that webinar there. And then kind of the third piece, which we're going to spend a lot of time on today, is the interpretation of the results. And this is really taking the time to digest and truly understand, right, what we're seeing and the output of these models. And this is, I think, another one that is oftentimes, if you're not careful, rushed through, especially when there's an expressed need for a quick turnaround or for immediate wins, and that can, result in less than optimal, I think, results from this. So, we're going to talk about that a little bit more and have Corey kind of show us what he put together from a visualization perspective to help out with this. But I do think there's a couple different approaches you can take with this interpretation. I think the first, and it's really about a mindset, I think, when you're going into audience modeling. And the first is really, let's just be in a spirit of discovery, right? Let's take a step back and really just allow this model to do what it's meant to do, and to group individuals and find patterns that we maybe weren't aware of or didn't know about previously. And then from those results, really developing messaging and targeting and advertising around what you find out, what you learn from those clusters. And this, it's not always easy, and there are often a lot of data points to sift through to get to this point of even understanding, what we want to include in these types of models. So there's, a lot of times, a lot of iteration that goes on here, but this is kind of the piece that we're hoping to walk through in a little bit more detail with Corey later on. And then the second is really, you have already in mind a particular goal, campaign, something that you want to push. And really the factor that's driving this analysis is to try to identify the customers that are most ripe for that particular campaign or for that targeting, and are likely to respond positively to that crafted message, right? And both approaches are completely valid. But if you don't know your audience, or even if you think you know your audience really well, it may be useful to kind of take a step back and to, see what the data actually has to say. You might be surprised about what you find, and the composition of the clusters could really unlock some important vital information, which could completely change the way that you think about messaging and targeting. And finally, the last step is actioning on that, right? What you find. So data activation could be targeted email campaigns, Facebook ads, yada, yada, yada. But again, I think the important thing to note here is that it's really useful only if you can activate on those IDs in a timely manner and quickly. And that's, again, where we get back to kind of the data pipeline piece. And I think that first step being so crucial. But okay, now that we kind of established some of the background and foundation for audience modeling, we're going to walk through a specific use case in which we use this clustering to great effect.
Before we jump ahead, I just want to say I love that turn of phrase you just coined. What was it? Spirit of discovery. I feel like that's one that I haven't heard us use before. I feel like it speaks really well to really sort of the core of what we do here at Softcrylic, you know. And I have other ways that I speak about it, but I feel like spirit of discovery, like that should be on like a ship, or it should be like our team mascot. I feel like that's awesome. I think we need to capture that one and put that one aside for use later. I think that's awesome. So,
absolutely.
All right. Next slide.
So yeah, just looking at this particular case study here, we had some background with this client already and kind of already used some of our other services with them in terms of data engineering and so forth. And but for this particular ask, they had decided that they wanted to understand their consumer base a little bit more fully, and they wanted to use this knowledge to then build out more personalized messaging and ad campaigns. So in particular, in this case, they wanted to focus on identifying customers that had a proclivity towards premium products. And so, you know, a very basic layout here of those steps was kind of identifying these customers who had that proclivity, targeting them with a sort of A/B test or experimental design, and then finally to really measure what we're seeing when we try to employ those results and use those to drive those tests. Okay, so and then we're going to break down this first step a little bit further. The next slide here. So finding these, identifying these consumers with that high proclivity or greater proclivity towards that premium product is kind of a threefold process, right? First thing is, as we talked about already, is collecting that data. The second being running the unsupervised machine learning model. And then the third is what we're going to delve into a little bit more here. And that's actually unpacking those results again and identifying distinct personas, right, that really describe the kind of the group and what constitutes and what characterizes that group of individuals.
So just, I know you don't want to get too into the weeds on this, sure, but you also know I'm like completely fascinated by it and I won't leave it alone. So when you spoke to earlier, you said the unsupervised clustering, like you're not giving any guidance to the model on what to look for. Like it's just going in and analyzing relationships right, that, like you said, are undetectable to the human eye. Like, I mean, that's completely fascinating to me. That's the one thing I wish I understood better.
Yeah. So again, I think that I'm going to try to stay out of the weeds too much here, but yeah, that's kind of the that's kind of the beauty of it, right? Is that it doesn't take a whole lot from you per se. Like, yes, there is some iteration involved. There is, as you're looking, through these clustering results, there is the opportunity to compare different clustering algorithms, which all accomplish kind of different things, and that the performance of each of those is going to basically depend on the actual shape and characteristics of your data. But yeah, I would say maybe the hardest part about it is really making sure that you're giving it the proper data set or the right fields that you really want to be looking at. But even that, you can kind of eliminate a lot of that noise through just some pre-processing steps in the data. So even if you give too much data, there's always some pretty simple ways to kind of cut through some of that noise and get to what's really important and what is driving a lot of the difference between the different groups. And so, yeah, from a very high level, I guess what it's trying to do is just identify groups of customers that behave very similar to one another inside of that same group, but then are different and statistically significantly different from the other groups and how they behave and the characteristics that kind of comprise those groups. But yeah, it is really crazy how that works.
That's a good synopsis. Thanks. I think I warned you I was going to put you on the spot, but that just to me it's just like complete. I could geek out on that for forever. So all right, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. So here we kind of already had some knowledge about this particular client, and again, kind of having set up some of that data for them as well. It was relatively straightforward for us to identify the pieces that we wanted to include from a data perspective. So not to read through all of them here, but, demographic data, product profile, right, their proclivity for whether they already have been buying premium products or not. And then kind of from the digital side, looking at page views, right, time spent on site, how many times they're bouncing, or how many times they interact with kind of email clicks and other advertising. And we then feed all that stuff again into the clustering algorithm, allow it to work its voodoo magic, right? And again, I think this text does a really good job of describing what clustering is trying to do, right? It's minimize the differences within the groups and maximize the difference between those groups that were identified. And then really, after it's run and you have some pretty good results there, I would say the bulk of the work is really in analyzing those results and seeing what you have there, and if it makes sense intuitively. How do these, what actually makes up one group and what differentiates them from another? And that's where I think some of the fun really comes into play. And Corey, I'm going to kind of hand it off to you so you can kind of walk through some of that discovery we did here with these clustering results and what we found.
Awesome. Thank you, Josiah. So, like I said, my team got involved with the effort once, everything Josiah has talked about in terms of that clustering analysis was sort of already delivered. And I wanted to just sort of call out, some of the larger pieces of the engagement with the client, just because, again, everything we really do at Softcrylic is always sort of a team effort, a sort of a collaboration between our various practice areas. And, as I like to say, that there's no such thing as a pure reporting engagement. There's no engagement where DataViz gets involved and there's no work from any of our other team in order to make the reporting happen. And so, I just wanted to call out that, again, across our practices in this engagement with the customer, data engineering was involved in the collection and integration pieces and the data prep. The data science and analytics teams were involved in this segmentation analysis. And then really, it went even deeper than that as we moved forward into this whole MTA effort, multi-touch attribution, where we were trying to move past, attributing marketing performance to the last touch and being able to sort of attribute it across, the whole customer journey across multiple channels, multiple touches, really sort of being able to understand a deep attribution there. Better understanding of attribution was what made this whole idea of the cluster analysis both possible and attractive to the customer. As I sort of poked at Josiah a little bit here, this idea of unsupervised learning is completely fascinating in terms of, how the algorithm establishes these relationships in the cluster and between them and separates them. But the subsequent challenge then becomes for us as human beings to understand these clusters and what they represent, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
typically,
real quick, if I can just, so for kind of the visualization piece here, we were already doing some stuff with this client, right? Before we brought in this clustering analysis. Can you talk a little bit about what we were doing there and how this kind of, incorporating that clustering piece was, I don't know, how you did that and what was the benefit there?
Oh goodness. So yeah, I
just briefly, if you're going to touch on a little bit later, that's okay too. I just
I think it's fine. I think so. We were already looking at membership demographics and working with the membership demographic data, and we were already using that to sort of give them the capabilities to look at who their audience was for a given campaign, or to actually build an audience from scratch. And I'll get into maybe diving into that a little bit further once we get to that visual. But yeah, it's a good question, because that really the previous work that we had done for the customer really ended up being sort of the dovetail into what we were able to do with the cluster analysis.
Yeah.
But absent that sort of data, when you start trying to visualize cluster analysis, it can be a little slim. And so typically when we start trying to visualize clusters in the absence of sort of detailed customer information, we get something like what you're looking at now, which is actually super interesting. But it's, and I think I picked this slide because this one, it's really easy to see. You can see the stratification in the clusters here. And what we're looking at is the tenure of the customer in the platform. And you can see that the algorithm has definitely stratified this by tenure. Although we've got that pink cluster, the cluster number 4 at the bottom, that spans across them all. So something else is driving that cluster, but the other 4 are very tightly stratified. And this is not on this particular project. This is a slide that I pulled from another cluster project that we've been working on. But it's something that just sort of jumped out at me on my first pass through the data.
Yeah, I think it's a really simplified view too, right, of it, which is nice. And that it's just kind of those 2 pieces that you're looking at here. So it's
I'm just looking at the count of the members in the cluster, and then by their tenure. And so I'm not aggregating. Each dot is an individual count of an actual tenure duration. So one of the things that we talk about, and I think dovetails really nicely with the spirit of exploration thing, one of the things that we talk about so much in like our other seminars, like the Dashboard in a Day program, et cetera, is how critical the exploratory phase is when we're doing any sort of presentation of the data. Whether that's an analytics presentation or whether it's a automated reporting presentation or whatever. There's always this phase where we're just sort of digging in and getting to understand the data. And the tools that we use give us, our great force multipliers when it comes to that, and give us all sort of ways to do that more efficiently and more, in greater quantity. But it's still our ability to comprehend what we're seeing that leads to the, to insight and the ability to really expose great data stories to our customers. And so in this case, when I showed this to the data science team, including Josiah and Brad, the response I got was that this is actually a great result in terms of the coherence of the cluster. But then the caveat was, unfortunately, it never works this well in the real world. So either something is working outstandingly well here, or something is completely broken.
Yep.
And in either case, seeing this sort of prompted us to go back and look at that work again, just to make sure that this was really the expected output that we would get. And so this is a nice view of where we can sort of immediately get some insight into what's going on with our cluster ring, but it still doesn't tell us a lot about who these people are in these particular clusters. And so, there are a number of different visuals that we use to sort of dig into that. And this second slide is another one that we typically use. And I love 3D scatters, and they're such a great way to show that clusters exist. In this case, we've used like a dimensionality reduction algorithm to reduce the dimensionality down to these 3 axes, to X, Y, and Z. And we're plotting sort of the aggregate like separation of and cohesiveness of these clusters in that 3-dimensional space that we're reducing down from all the dimensions that we have in the data. And again, this is super useful. And I think like in this case, like illustrative is such a great word. That's actually the right word for this context. This is illustrative of what's going on with our clustering. But it still leaves me hanging, especially if I'm someone in the business trying to really wrap my head around this. It really doesn't tell me anything about who these clusters are, right? Josiah, I'm not missing something I need to decode here, right?
No, I'd say you're about right there. It's a pretty picture that at least, demonstrates, from an illustrative perspective, as you said, that there are, recognizable and distinguishable differences we can kind of suss out here between those groups, but this isn't going to be, the final thing we show. There's going to be some explanation right after this that kind of talks about, okay, what actually, differentiates those groups, what's driving that.
Right. And so that's when my team was asked to get involved, is to say, okay, look, we've got this. We know that we've isolated some interesting behavioral groups here, and we think we've got something actionable. But how do we tell that story to the stakeholders in the business, and how do we make them see the potential here? And you asked me a minute ago, Josiah, like how we sort of came to the solution that we came at. And you're right. We had previously built out this tool for exploring our customers' membership data, which actually sort of enabled them to visually slice and dice the membership pool and export audiences for targeted campaigns via whatever channel, whether that's social or direct email or in-app or
Awesome.
whatever there was in a way to target a customer. And this was a natural outgrowth of the work that we'd already done, in order to facilitate other kinds of targeted marketing campaigns for the customer. So this was just sort of an organic outgrowth of where we've gotten started here. And I know that our cluster analysis itself had involved demographics, but it was a little bit difficult to parse that from the results, right? I mean, it wasn't something that would just immediately jump out at you off the page unless you were looking for it in terms of, what was the demographic makeup of these clusters. So what we did is we went and we linked the individual cluster members back to their demographic data, and we were able to sort of rapidly take a previous tool and extend it into something that was going to end up looking a lot like this. And this is a screenshot, but I do have an actual version of the tool here handy that we can play with a little bit. I had the screenshot there just in case something went wrong with the actual interactive tool. Now this is dummied up results. I want to make sure that we're not showing you actual customer information, but this isn't far from the actual tool we delivered. And really what you can do with this is pretty slick. You can already use it to slice and dice the audience by these various demographic parameters. We've got things like gender. We could pick female, homeowner status, no, but let's say they're married and they have kids, and we select these things, and it should be updating. Yeah, it's clicking and whirring. Give it a second, and we see as soon as it's done, we'll get a new number for that audience size. We're down to 8,505, and we see that the map updates. We can see that the age distribution has changed and the income distribution. The balance of their membership points has changed. Our education codes, what education levels they have. So this is already useful in terms of looking at a market, and we can zoom in on the map and see, so if we were looking at Seattle, sort of see what this population would look like in the greater Seattle area. But with the clusters, we can do even more with this. So if I reset this back to the way it was, and I don't know if you guys remember, but I'm pretty sure, and I know, again, this is mocked up, but I'm pretty sure that the mock-up clusters were similar to the production. And I think cluster 5 was sort of our most interesting cluster in terms of showing a clear increase in responsiveness from the general population. So if we dive into cluster 5 and go back to the same geolocation, and let's say we're gonna, my selector's working, and select just the greater Seattle area. Now we're down to just 3. I thought I had more in that geo. But anyway, we'd be able, that's going to not end up being a great example. So let me do, on dry run, I promise you there was more than 3 in there. But anyway, the idea being that we can drill in and really see by, in a given geo for a given cluster, we can sub-target within the cluster even and look at, do we want to look at cluster 5, but then maybe we want to target, the West Coast. And we want to say, let me try this one more time and see if I can get it right this time. But say I want to target the West Coast with cluster 5, and let's do the whole West Coast. And really 14? All right. That's not going to work, guys. My apologies. It was all right. So one last try. Rather than sub-target geo, let's just forget that part. And but let's look at what we can do with the other demographic indicators. So so if I click on 5 again, and we see we're down to this this cluster audience, and say I wanted to look at women who are homeowners in this audience. And then if I wanted to say between the age of 40 and 80, and with a minimum income, well, let's not even touch that. We're down to now to around 6,000 in this audience. And we can see how the age distribution looks, and how that income distribution and education looks as well. And we can say, okay, this is an audience that we'd really, maybe there's an offer that we can definitely target to. And when we were able to show this to the business, this is really where the light bulb started to switch on in the room, and where the business could really sort of visually see how these sorts of analysis might be extremely interesting to their marketing efforts. And
I guess if I can just tag onto that too, right? I mean, this was something obviously we created, but then made available to them, right? So even after kind of telling them what the important things were to really pay attention to, they were given the ability, right, to kind of play with this themselves. And basically, if they wanted to check on something, they had the ability to go in there and tweak some things and corroborate what we found, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the and so they were able to see the results themselves, and play with the results themselves.
Because I just think that's kind of one of the biggest things that along with kind of this clustering and machine learning stuff is it can be extracted so far away from the actual data and the consumers themselves that it gets to just be this black box concept, right? And there's not really this understanding of what's gone into it, what's the data points that went into it, and what are we really finding as a result of it, without, again, being able to in this way, we can actually tangibly kind of play with that and tease some things out of it. But I think that's just, it's awesome how we did this because it makes it a lot more accessible, right? And you can actually see what constitutes and characterizes these clusters, rather than just having someone come to you and say, these are the clusters we're going to use, and here's the average age and gender, for instance, or something like that. This kind of gives a lot more of a complete picture here in terms of what we were seeing. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and like you said, it is awesome. And I love those moments where you get to watch like light bulbs click on for people, and you get that look on their face where they're like, wow, this could really, this could really be a game changer in one way or the other. And being part of those sorts of deliveries is always a great thing for me and the rest of the DataViz team. So I think you've got a couple more slides to talk about, right?
Pretty quickly, yeah. It'll be we're going to kind of gloss over these, but I think really from kind of having worked with Corey and looked at a lot of those visualizations, we were able to really tease out 4 clear personas, right? Or we really focus in on, I don't know if you noticed on the last graphic, but there were 9 clusters that came out of or 10 clusters, I believe, that came out of this. But 4 of them were really, we honed in on those. And these are kind of the personas that we created to describe those things. So first being reliable retirees, right? So this was an incredibly high percentage of these users were already buying premium products, right? 72% we see there. And they're extremely active members with, an older age bracket they fall into here, and not a whole lot of marketing engagement with these folks. The second one, by contrast, we see the sophisticated savers. They had some marketing engagement, right? And a decent portion of them, almost 40%, were buying premium products. But they also had a long tenure and a high rewards balance, which kind of differentiated them there. So they were saving up and accruing these rewards. The third cluster we see here, we had trendsetters, right? Highly engaged with marketing. The highest number of web sessions out of any of these personas, and still around 30% purchased premium products before. So we know there's kind of an appetite for it, even if not everyone there has purchased that before. And then finally, the last one we notice here is prudent patrons. So they are, the kind of the lowest membership tier here. Not a whole lot in terms of engaging with marketing. Not too many sessions, online sessions throughout the year. And so really from this, we were able to identify the two that stood out to us as being the most interesting and the most, I think, relevant for the particular campaign that our client was interested in here in terms of really looking at that premium product and trying to drive some additional purchases there. That was sophisticated savers and the trendsetters, right? Both are engaged with marketing. And unlike the kind of reliable retirees who have a really high percentage of people already buying premium products, these folks and sophisticated savers and trendsetters actually have and might benefit from that push to make that purchase, to make that premium product purchase. And so that's what we kind of focus in on for the experiment here. We can go to the next slide here, Corey. Awesome. So as we talked about a little bit at the beginning, the next step here would really be to take those clusters and those personas that we focus in on and to create a A/B test, right? To understand whether this marketing would actually drive any sort of lift in that premium product conversion. So we broke out the sophisticated savers and the trendsetters into test and control groups. And then we did a little bit more just to make sure this was actually going to be a good test. And prior to the campaign, we measured kind of the behavioral differences between the groups and noticed that there was only really about a 1.5% variance in behavior between the control group and the test group. And this kind of allowed us that additional confidence to make sure that these differences and changes in behavior that we may or may not observe after the campaign launch can really be attributed to the campaign messaging, right? Which is going to be the main difference between these two. And so we kind of have an example of what that messaging looked like here on the right side. It's not exactly verbatim what we were using, but it kind of captures the feeling of it, or the feeling behind it, right? The test group has a much more personalized message that connects with them and with what we learned about them from the clustering exercise. And then finally on this last slide here, Corey, if we can jump, we're going to look at kind of what happened here. And we saw what we wanted to see. We saw a lift in conversion, right? So the test group that received that more personalized messaging saw a lift in upgrades to premium products, in the redemption of premium products using rewards balances, and also in just straight up premium product purchases. And it's awesome. I mean, that's what we hope to see. And again, 1.7% might not seem massive, but when you talk about a pretty large population of users here, that's pretty incredible. So, and then I think really, just kind of as a retrospective here, what kind of drove and resulted in this, or drove these results, it really demonstrates kind of the power of what audience clustering can do in terms of helping discover and learn more about your audience, and what data visualization can do to help to really synthesize and understand the outcome of that modeling, and then the power of marketing strategy, right? And really executing on that to learn more and to understand if it really does drive that impact that you're hoping to see. And if that's the case, then continuing to roll out those kinds of ad campaigns in the future, and really using what you learn to drive that return on ad spend and increase that. So Yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add here, Corey, but I think it's just an awesome example of how we use that and got some great results from it.
Not at all, man. I think I think you summarized it really well. And just, the fact that not only were we able to, visually show our customers, where the clusters were and what they looked like, but then we were able to go ahead and deliver these kind of results and say, hey, not only have we been able to tell you who these people are, but we've actually been able to, significantly deliver a lift in their conversion rate and shift their behavior. I think it's fantastic. It's such a cool story end to end. So thanks, man. You've done a really nice job putting this together.
You too. I know. That dashboard is awesome. So, we saw how much they love that. So, yeah, sweet.
Well,
I guess, yeah, real quick. I don't see anything right now in the Q&A, but anyone else have?
Either. Sammy, have you got anything that we don't see yet?
I do not, no.
All right. Well, in that case, I think thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining, and follow up if you guys have any other questions that weren't answered here or that you want to know more about.